Okay, well, we are at 9:02, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So good morning, everybody. My name is Kelly Atori, and thank you for joining us for our speaker, Tim Dixon, who's going to give a talk today on climate policy and the Paris Agreement. It is April 22nd, 2022. So before we get started, just as a reminder to you guys, next week we will have Adam Simon from the University of Michigan giving a talk on metal resources for the transition to carbon neutrality. So if you don't make it till the end of today's talk, please remember to attend next week's talk. And just for some basic admin stuff, please keep muted until the end of the talk. If you think you're going to forget your questions, you're welcome to type it in the chat box, and then we'll handle the questions at the end so we don't distract him during his talk. So with that, Ramon Trevino is going to introduce Tim today. So thanks a bunch for being here, Tim, and thanks, Ramon, for doing the introduction. Turn it over to you.
It's my pleasure. I've known Tim for well over a decade. I don't remember exactly when we met Tim because it's sort of in the mists of the past now. But Tim is the head of the IEA-GHG, which is the International Energy Agency Greenhouse Gas Division. He was appointed as general manager of IEA-GHG in June of 2019. It's an international research organization focused on the development and deployment of carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And IEA-GHG activities include technical studies, expert networks, the premier global conference on CCUS, which is called GHGT, Greenhouse Gas Technology Conference, CCUS summer schools, and inputting evidence-based to international regulatory and policy developments. IEA-GHG is funded by 36 member countries and organizations. And Tim has been at IEA-GHG since 2008. He is the chair of multiple international steering committees, including for the GHGT conferences, the Offshore CCS Workshop Series, which was started and is supported by IEA-GHG and was started in conjunction with GCCC. The Monitoring Network, and the chair for the advisory committee for multiple CCS projects. Recent examples include GOMCARB, which is a partnership funded by DOE here at BEG, and then STEM CCS, which is a project in the EU. Outside IEA-GHG, Tim is also a director on the board of the International CCS Knowledge Center in Canada, an honorary senior research fellow at the BEG, an honorary lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, and a mentor at the University of Oxford School of Climate Change. He was previously seconded to the Global CCS Institute in Australia and to the UK government, and was an original board member of the UK CCS Research Centre. Before IEA-GHG, Tim worked on CCS and clean energy technologies for the UK government and for AEA technology at Hartwell in the UK. Tim has been active in UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, since 1999, representing CCS since 2005. He was the EU's lead negotiator on CCS in 2011-2012, successfully getting CCS adopted by the UNFCCC into the Clean Development Mechanism at the COP 2017, the Conference of the Parties. Most recent meeting was in Glasgow last year. He was also a UK negotiator and advisor for getting CCS in the London Convention 2004-2007, in OSPAR 2006-2007, the EU CCS Directive 2006-2008, and the EU ETS 2006 through 2009. Tim has a BSc in Applied Physics from the University of Hull and an MBA from Oxford Brookes University, and is a fellow for the Energy Institute and a member of the Institute of Physics and the UK Environmental Law Association. Tim, it's a pleasure to have you here with us again today, and please, we look forward to hearing your talk.
Okay, thank you very much, Ramon, for that introduction, and Kelly, thank you for the introduction as well. So I'll just share my screen. And if you could save your questions, I'm happy to take lots, but can you save them till the end? Because I can't see the chat box when I am screen sharing. So I'm very proud to be an honorary research fellow at the BEG since 2014, I think, since Sue hosted our conference, the GT13 conference there. And my main role working with BEG is in the offshore CCS workshop series. And I was last there giving this Friday seminar talk in 2019, but there's been significant development since then in international climate policy. So we thought it might be useful or interesting to give you an update. Although COP26 is now 5 months ago, we did intend this was going to be me there in person in January in conjunction with the UTCCS 6 conference, but Omicron made that go fully virtual. And then we thought there would be some offshore project meetings around this time in April, so hence the date. They've actually moved to May now, so I do apologise that it's fully remote today. But the coincidence is also slightly beneficial in that today's Earth Day. If you've gone onto Google at all, you'll have seen their images, and the focus or the emphasis is for this year's Earth Day is on climate change, which is the topic today as well. And I just a last apology, my voice isn't fully back yet. I'm just recovering from COVID over the last 2 weeks. So if I pause, I'll try and be quick with the microphone to mute myself if I'm going to cough. So apologies in advance. So COP26 and outcomes for CCUS. And first of all, I just do have to show our disclaimer. As IAGHG, we were set up by the International Energy Agency as a technology collaboration program, but we are separate from them. So anything I say does not reflect their views, but I do use their material a lot, and we do work closely with them as well. And as Ramon was going through the acronyms, you can play acronym bingo if you'd like. There's the UNFCCC is full of acronyms, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the main global agreement on climate change. And our role as IAGHG is providing information into this. And the last big agreement was the Paris Agreement in 2015. As IAGHG, we've been very involved in the UNFCCC over the years, directly in the negotiations, providing evidence based on CCS up to 2011, as Ramon said. And then since then, more in an awareness raising role, sharing information and developments on CCUS, working in partnership with BEG, University of Texas, through Catherine Bromanak, where we've been successful in getting the main official side event at each of these COPs on CCS, and the only side event on CCS at all of these COPs. And there's a lot of competition for these, and we've been successful at every one so far. And they're important because the audience is really wide. It's the 197 countries that are in the UNFCCC. So you really are reaching out to countries who are maybe just starting to think about CCS, and they're coming along to learn. And my favorite question is, can I do it in my country? And we get that a lot at our side events. And we've even been able to work with those in the COPs who do the official surveys through the university in Sweden, and published a paper just last year on surveying, using their data to survey the attendees at our side events as well. So we've provided some sort of reassuring messages that we were doing the right thing in the right way, aiming to reach the right audiences. So that's what we've been busy doing. The Paris Agreement in 2015 was the replacement for the Kyoto Protocol. It's got the headline targets of aiming to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees by the end of the century, and to pursue limiting it to 1.5, and to reach net zero in the second half of the century, but that's been interpreted by being by mid-century. And it's different in its nature because it's based upon every country volunteering what it's going to do itself, not like the Kyoto Protocol that put obligations on emissions reductions on developed countries. The Paris Agreement asks countries to volunteer themselves what are they going to do to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and in adaptation. And these voluntary actions are called nationally determined contributions. That's another acronym for you, NDCs. And it's up to each country and what they put into these completely. And the obligation on them is only to, when they are updated every 5 years, to represent the progression on the previous one in terms of mitigation. And to have transparency in reporting as well. So Paris Agreement 2015, first update June 2020 at COP26. And we all know what happened. COVID came along and the COP was postponed by a year because of COVID. Where we were, there had been a rush of political momentum for the Paris Agreement, and we had lots of NDCs submitted that moved us from the emissions trajectory looking towards the end of the century. We were heading towards 3.6 degrees, and these moved us down towards 2.7 degrees of warming in 2015. Well, what happened in between in this gap between the previous COP in 2019 and the COP26 in 2021 is a lot more information came out in general, but specifically around climate change and energy. And my colleagues in the IEA in Paris produced their Energy Technology Perspectives report in 2020, which they had a 3-year gap since they produced that. And this shows the role of the energy sector in reducing emissions. They showed the different technologies, all of them which are needed to get to net zero by 2050. And CCUS, carbon capture, utilization and storage, has a major role to play, 25% of all that mitigation effort, along with all the renewable technology, energy efficiency, reducing demand, electrification, and etc. Nuclear and hydrogen as well. And they also, from that big piece of work, pulled out a specific report on CCUS. And there they nicely sort of summarized the main unique roles of CCUS in tackling emissions. And that's firstly, tackling emissions from existing energy assets. It could be retrofitted to your existing coal or gas power stations or cement plant. And this is really important for these countries, especially you've got young energy assets with decades of lifetime left, particularly in developing countries. They can't afford to rip them down and start again. But you can bolt this technology on to decarbonize them. It's also, as you probably all know, you can reach the bits that you can't decarbonize easily by other means. So the heavy industries such as cement, that's 7% of the world's CO2 emissions, iron and steel, that's 8% of the world's CO2 emissions, that's double aviation. They can be decarbonized with CCS, and even aviation potentially through the creation of synthetic aviation fuel from carbon dioxide. People are now talking and getting more interested in hydrogen because, again, hydrogen itself as an energy vector can decarbonize sectors you can't decarbonize by other means, such as long distance transport or domestic house heating. And an early low cost, low carbon way of producing hydrogen is from methane with CCS on to capture the CO2. So you can start off the hydrogen economy. And the last one is removing carbon from the atmosphere through direct air capture or through bioenergy with CCS BECCS. And the climate models are saying we really need to be including this to cope with those emissions that we can't reduce by other means in order to get to net zero. So CCS does all of those things. And I like the way they present that for audiences wider than the CCS world. And specifically in the run-up to COP26, given the extra year to do some more work, the IEA produced this net zero by 2050 roadmap that went into more detail for what the energy sector can do to reach net zero. So it's one set of pathways. So it's not a rule, it's not telling everyone what to do, but it's one set of pathways that would get us there for the energy sector by 2050. And there are some headline things in here that you may have been aware of, like no new oil and gas field developments, no new coal mines from now. But basically, those are in the context of if you do everything in here, there's a lot of everything: electrification of vehicles, electrification of other end use, lots of energy efficiency, lots of renewables. If you do all of that, then you don't need to develop new oil and gas fields now, or new coal mines now. But phasing out unabated coal in advanced economies, then later on phasing out unabated coal in developing countries. Through all of this, they nicely quantified the amount of CCS or CCUS that would be needed, and that's by 2035, 4 gigatons of CO2 per year to be captured, mostly through CCS, but some through direct air capture as well, and then 7.6 gigatons by 2050 per annum. Now those numbers, 4 gigatons, that's 100 times more than we're doing in the world at the moment with CCS. That's 100 times scale up in just 13 years, or less than 13 years. So there's a lot needs to happen on CCS and all the other options in here as well. So this was a major input to COP26 and produced in the summer. So we get to COP26 itself in November last year in Glasgow in the UK, co-hosted with Italy, but it was basically UK driven, UK presidency. And these are the 4 bullets, the 4 presidency goals reflect the 4 main objectives of this COP. So not just the UK's, but in general. The first was to try and, because of the updated NDCs, to try and get to net zero by 2050 and keep 1.5 degrees within reach. And I think they just about did that. I think one of the UK officials said 1.5, it's still alive, but it's on a life support machine, was their phrase. In terms of increasing work on adaptation, particularly for developing countries, including resilient infrastructure. Some was achieved on this, but not really enough and not much financing. So that wasn't really achieved. There was also this pledge about mobilizing climate finance to reach $100 billion a year, particularly going from developed to developing countries. That wasn't reached. I think they got to 60 or 70 billion, and that was counting every single thing they could possibly count in that as well. But the 4th bullet point was really important because to make the Paris Agreement work, all the rules and details had been agreed in 2018, except for one part of it called Article 6, and that's the bit to do with international cooperation. And it's basically around setting up carbon markets, the international carbon markets. And that hadn't been finalized in 2018 and needed to be done to start the carbon market system working. And they did. They reached this, and they reached decisions on these. And there's 2 parts of most significance in Article 6. That's 6.2, which is cooperative approaches, which is between countries. So one country can do a low carbon activity in another country and receive the benefit from those. And there's a new acronym for you there if you're playing acronym bingo, ITMOs, and also OIMPs, which is other international mitigation purposes. And that's the link to the voluntary carbon markets. And 6.4, which is a project-based carbon credit generation system, like the clean development mechanism was under the Kyoto Protocol. So with those, I'll come back to those in a moment. But in terms of the broader picture, so we were looking at only heading, all the policies in the world were still taking us towards 2.7 degrees in the UNFCCC's official stock take in last summer. But there was a rush of new, updated and revised NDCs just before the COP itself in October. And Climate Action Tracker did a quick calculation and projection and said the new ones would now take us, instead of 2.7 degrees, take us down to 2.4 degrees of warming. Not enough, but it's movement in the right direction. And my colleagues in the IEA in Paris also took, because even during the COP, there were new pledges coming up, not the NDCs to which countries are held to account by, but countries were also making net zero pledges, saying that in general terms, they would achieve net zero by a date. That's Germany and Switzerland 2045, UK, US, Canada by 2050, I think China 2060, Brazil 2060, Indonesia, Russia 2060, India 2070. And they don't need to have any means of achieving them necessarily. Many countries do have them and they are in law, but not all of them. So they're less rigorous, so to speak, than the NDCs. But the IEA looked at those as well, and the other pledges, agreements outside of the UNFCCC that happened at COP, such as on methane. And so taking all that broader portfolio into account, instead of heading towards 2.1, we're now heading towards 1.8 degrees. And what was significant for me was that this felt like it was almost happening in real time during the COP. And I've never experienced that since I've been going to the COPs since 1999. Countries were moving forwards in their pledges and NDCs. So that was very promising. It's heading in the right direction. But NDCs only get updated every 5 years. I'll come on to that on the next slide. And in the NDC updates, as of the second week of COP, of the 197 countries, 123 have been submitted, and 19 had CCS in, which sounds quite low. And these NDCs are looking to 2030, what these countries will be doing to 2030, between now and 2030. So only 19 will be doing CCS for mitigation. But what they're doing is putting in the easier to do mitigation into those. What's more promising is that the Paris Agreement also requires countries to submit long-term greenhouse gas strategies looking to the mid-century. And this is good because it makes countries look beyond, makes governments look beyond their political horizons. And they're realizing that, yes, they can put the easy to do stuff in the 2030 NDCs, they've got to go further after that. And most of those contain CCS. So in the second week of COP, 33 out of the 43 submitted had CCS as a major activity. I've not fully caught up with these, but since then we've had them in from Nigeria, Cambodia, Morocco, Colombia, and Malta with CCS in as well. If any country has a large point source of CO2, they don't have many options really to address those, particularly from industry. And it's these countries that we are very interested in who come along to our side events at COPs. So the overarching agreement that came out of COP26 was called the Glasgow Climate Pact. You know, it welcomed the work of the IPCC, that's good. And on the NDCs, really importantly, instead of updating in another 5 years' time, there's a request that countries update them by the end of this year, 2022, still with a target year of 2030. So that gives countries a chance to go further again in their NDCs. So it's a request. We'll see how many do it. Fingers crossed, a lot of them will do it. And there's also a specific section in there on clean energy technologies, which you might expect. It encourages the development and deployment of clean energy technologies. But a really important term got introduced during the negotiations. It wasn't in at the beginning, and it made the news about this phase down of coal power and phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. But during the negotiations, they added the word unabated. This means without CCS. So it's the phase down of coal power without CCS, which means coal power and fossil fuel use with CCS is okay to continue. It would make sense to us, but in this environment, it's really important to have that clarification in there. So that was in the overall outcomes that came out and have really set the political environment now for countries moving forwards on their climate change policies. In terms of the detail on the Article 6 parts, I said that the decisions were reached on these. They create now the framework for international carbon trading between countries and from projects. And really important is within these, the accounting integrity is in there through this concept called corresponding adjustments. So if a country funds a project in another country and claims those carbon credits or the carbon reductions, they can't both be claimed by both countries towards their NDCs. they can only go to one country's NDC. So there's no double counting. That's really important that that principle is in place. Also, from our perspective, from IIGHG, following the negotiations, the text remained technology neutral. So it didn't exclude any technology, including CCS. So it's implicitly included. And actually the text on these explicitly refers to CO2 removals, the direct air removal from the atmosphere, direct CO2 removal from the atmosphere. There was one slight ambiguity, if you're really into the Article 6 emissions trading side of the things, that there was a point about avoiding carbon intensive practices. And we've spotted and we flagged this up and we tried to intervene, couldn't get it clarified in time, but afterwards the negotiators assured me that it wasn't to say avoiding, because CCS on any fossil fuel activity could be regarded as carbon intensive. It was not intended to avoid CCS on fossil fuel activities. So what we're asking for is clarification on that, just so nobody misinterprets that going forwards. And there's some further work to be done on the details on how to account for CO2 removals, particularly putting in place a supervisory body for the 6.4 and so on. So there's some more detail to be done that we'll follow those. And that's within the UNFCCC. Outside of the UNFCCC, other things happened at the same time because you had all the countries together in person, 10,000 people a day. Was it 27,000 people attending in total, COP26, with very low rates of COVID as well, I'm pleased to say. And in all of these other agreements that were reached, again, the general move away from unabated fossil power generation. Good to see that even though there are major differences between US and China, that they can still work together on climate change, including on CCUS and DAC. And the US's announcements, its energy Earthshot CDR goal of getting the cost of carbon dioxide removal down to $100 a ton by 2030 was launched, and the new Mission Innovation Initiative on CDR to get the world at reaching 100 million tons per annum by 2030 through CDR as well. So lots happened there. It's a very busy environment, lots of negotiations going on. And the main way officially of getting evidence based in the latest information on climate change, climate science, mitigation, etc., is through the side events that happen. And we were fortunate, again, through working through with Catherine Romanak from the University of Texas. We had our application accepted. So I think there were well over 1,000 applications for something like 200 or 300 side events. We were given a studio to do it from, and you can see there that we had Jennifer Wilcox from the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management there to speak, as well as we had the focus on decarbonising industries, in particular at this one. So we had a very good turnout, over 300 people attending virtually that studio-based side event. And then even better than that, we managed to get an in-person side event as well, thanks to Bologna. And there we had sharing learnings between developing countries. And that's a very popular concept in the UNFCCC. It's got a term, it's called the South-South cooperation. And it's so that they're not feeling like they're being told what to do by developed countries, but they're learning from each other instead. And so we had Nigeria, we had Trinidad and Tobago and Indonesia, who are quite advancing along the CCS curve, sharing their experiences with Nigeria and with India as well, and an audience that the room was full. And again, we had over 300 people attending in the remote connection to that as well. And very high profile attendance from the Nigerian government at that. So again, reaching out to countries, as well as taking questions from those who are less enthusiastic on CCS as well. It's a very rich environment, the COPs. As I'm showing through these pictures here, mostly from this COP, there were a fewer, civil society has the right place in there, and there were youth groups of NGOs and environmental NGOs who go in there. They were very modest in their protests inside. They didn't get in the way of the negotiations, so that was good. But they make their voices heard. But outside the COP, there was a 100,000 strong march on the middle Saturday, which actually is a working day in the COPs. But people did see it through social media, and a few other protests that didn't really get in the way. And every day the environmental NGOs do their Fossil of the Day award. This is actually from the previous COP because they did it fully virtual at this one, but they still did the awards, and they play the soundtrack to Jurassic Park, and they try and name and shame the countries that are doing badly or least well in the negotiations. And this is the leaderboard from COP26. You see at different times, different countries were not performing as well as the environmental NGOs wanted them to. And surprisingly, for the first time, a non-country got in there, IETA, on the 3rd of November. And that's because they had a lot of fossil fuel companies on their delegation. And as you know, and we know, fossil fuel companies are part of the solution. They've got the subsurface expertise. You've got to bring them with you. They're very keen themselves to be doing CCUS. But in the eyes of some of the environmental NGOs, they didn't like the numbers in there. But I show this slide also because the lead of the UK's Climate Change Committee, a very respected person, after COP, said that he thought COP26, as well as the importance of the NDCs being updated, the governments there were under pressure from the companies who were inside the COPs, businesses wanting more certainty so that they can take action in a more certain business environment. And they're concerned that they're in the COP because they're concerned about climate change. But outside the COP, you had the public, civil society from across the world protesting as well. The pressure from both sides on governments is how he put it. And he said he thinks that maybe helped governments to be a little bit bolder in some of the details of the agreements that they were reaching as well. So interesting just points to put in. What I'd end with is the IPCC. They produced 3 main reports in their phases. We're in assessment report 6 phase at the moment. They do these assessment reports every 7 years. Normally, COVID's delayed this one a bit. 3 working groups. Working group 1 on the science of climate change. They got their report out in August last year in time for the COP. That's about the science of climate change in the atmosphere and then impacts on the oceans. But it also included aspects around CDR and the need for CDR and the role of CDR and what happens under the different climate scenarios, including if we don't do much now, but do a lot of carbon dioxide removal later, CDR, and go net negative in the future, not net zero, but net negative with CDR, it's not as good as reducing emissions now because there will be a rebound effect by degassing of the biosphere and the oceans and CO2 being released that's currently trapped in those. So it's better still to do all your emissions reductions now and not just rely on CDR later. Working group 2 focuses on the impacts and adaptation. We don't normally look at that report, but they actually included some bits about impacts of mitigation activities, including CCS and direct air capture. And some bits got in there that we weren't happy with, but we didn't review that report to do with water use and those. We refocus our attentions on working group 3 and the mitigation of climate change. And that's where CCUS sits normally. And they produced 2 drafts. And these reports are quite substantial. Working group 1's report was just under 4,000 pages. Working group 2 was 3,600 pages. Working group 3's report out 2 weeks ago was 2,900 pages. So it's quite a job to expert review the drafts, but we are expert reviewers of those, and we take that quite seriously. And we try and correct where there is misinformation or misunderstanding on CCUS. And there was in the working group 3 to do with water usage and with direct air capture. And that was to do with very outdated assumptions being used from decades old papers. So we did correct that successfully in working group 3. We didn't realize those same points had made it into working group 2's report. So there's a little bit of things in there that we're not quite so pleased with, but they're out now, can't change them. So that's it. So working group 3, lots of information in there. Catherine Romanak was an expert reviewer as well. And thanks to her reviewing, there are papers cited by Ramon Gill, by Vanessa Nunez, by Syed Hussain and Emily Moskal. So that's very good for BEG to get some of your staff cited in this Working Group 3 report. This is going to have a lifetime now of 7 years. So it's a key document in its 2,900 pages. Unfortunately, there's not the nice information. There's lots on CCUS, but no nice figures or diagrams this time that there have been in the past to pull out and use. And all of these 3 reports get pulled together into what's called a synthesis report, which is due in September this year, timed specifically to be available ready for COP27 in Egypt. So what's happening next? There's some further detail to be done on the Article 6 in SUBSTA, sorry, that's another acronym, Subsidiary Body for Science and Technological Advice. They're meeting in June, and they're going to set up a supervisory body for the 6.4. Countries, not counties, apologies for that typo, countries will be revising and updating their NDCs. The synthesis report from IPCC will be published in time. And there's one gap in the increasing attention on the need for CDR, and the key technology for that is direct air capture. So every country reports its greenhouse gas emissions following the IPCC's greenhouse gas inventory guidelines. We've got the methodology in there for CCS, got the methodology or the principles in there for BECCS and biochar, but not for direct air capture. And so there's a rush to do direct air capture projects, which is very good. We need to develop and deploy at larger scale to demonstrate and bring down the costs. But at the moment, the accounting for those, the beneficiary aspects of CO2 removal is only recognized in the voluntary carbon markets and not in the official markets, which are called compliance markets. That's something that as IAGHG we're trying to work on as well to fill that gap. There's not a show-stopping issue. It's just a matter of getting that bit of IPCC to do the work on their inventory guidelines. And I'll just show this map from our colleagues at the Global CCS Institute. They do their global status reports every year, which are very helpful documents. This is not to show you the countries with CCS projects in, but just to point out all of those other countries that don't yet have CCS projects in. And those are the audiences in particular that we're aiming our events at COPs. And we now have progress with Trinidad and Tobago, with Nigeria, and very latest with Guyana starting to get interested in CCS as well. And of course, the Bureau of Economic Geology, a world centre of expertise in geological storage of CO2 in particular, monitoring and modelling of that. And I like the concept of the UT motto of what starts here changes the world. And I do see that actually happening in practice over my many years of working with BEG. I can say that really does happen. And with all of this information that's produced out there and all the initiatives and policies on CCUS and BECCS and direct air capture, it needs a lot of CO2 geological storage, and it needs the proof to show it's secure for the country's policies, for the accounting schemes, for the carbon trading under Article 6. It needs to be shown to be secure. And BEG is a world-leading expert in techniques and technologies to do that. So BEG has got a lot of work ahead, I think, a science and research provider to companies, through the GCC members in particular, but to governments as well, and to help governments understand what they need to be doing and when they develop regulations. As being R&D project leaders, as you've shown in the past, informing global policy with the research results. It's very reassuring for countries to learn how they can know that the CO2 is securely stored, and that it has been monitored and shown that at the world's largest CCS projects, well, as Petronova was at the time it was operating, that BEG were involved in. Reviewing important documents for the IPCC, very important as well, and great to have the BEG staff cited there. And increasingly, I'm seeing as a training provider for technology transfer and capacity building to developing countries, but also for the oil and gas industry, for their professionals to repurpose themselves to be able to undertake CO2 geological storage using and drawing upon the expertise that they've already got. And I see increasing demand for this from all around the world, in fact. So that's my update on COP26 and outcomes for CCUS. This global picture, very positive on climate change. It got as far, it achieved as much as it was possible to achieve, given that in the UNFCCC, you need all 197 countries to agree anything for anything to be agreed. So it moves at the pace of the most reluctant country, but all that it did achieve was very good as taking that into account. The frameworks are in place for international carbon trading that will help CCUS projects, because many of the project developers, as you know, are the multinational oil and gas companies who have international interests and international footprints, and they can look at where it might be best to do CCUS. And the Article 6 framework gives them a way of getting the credits to use then in the most appropriate places that will help them as well. So overall, I think it's a very positive outcome. The CCUS, the role for CCUS just gets stronger and stronger as we see the evidence coming out. So thank you very much for listening, and happy to take any questions.
Awesome. That was a great talk, Tim. It was it's inspiring to see that we are actually making progress. You know, you see so much in the news of the negativity of, you know, we're not doing enough, we're not going to make it. And, you know, it's exciting to see that we are doing a lot more than probably I think people know about. So that's very exciting to me.
And I think, you know, and Greta Thunberg, you know, was criticizing the COP for not doing enough. And I'm a big fan of Greta Thunberg. But you've got to take all the 197 countries with you. They've all got to agree that anything to be agreed. And that's it. So if you were starting from scratch, you couldn't design it that way. But because it's designed that way, and you can't change it unless all 197 countries agree. So you're sort of stuck with that system.
Yep.
Yeah.
Collaboration can be an issue sometimes. Okay. So going to questions. I see the first question actually was from Sue. Dave, I see your hand up, but Sue, did you want to unmute and ask your question?
So Tim, what do you think? What do you think the most missing information at the COP is? I mean, this is motivated by Bureau. What we can do is provide information. If you got to order some information for the next COP, what would it be?
We always get the question of storage security. How do we know it's secure? And so we explain the tools we have for doing that. So the information around the monitoring, the site characterization, site selection, and then the monitoring, we explain that, but we always get those questions. And then it's the question which I like the most is, can I do it in my country? And where do you start? Okay, you start by, you look at your geology, you get your National Geological Survey engaged, you look at the geology in your country, you look for sedimentary basins, and you start to do that assessment. And you look at then your point sources of CO2, which most countries have got a good idea of because they're reporting the emissions already, and do this sourcing matching activity. And that's basically what you see the multilateral banks funding in developing countries, such as we're seeing about to happen in Nigeria as the sort of latest one. But it's helping them to do this for themselves. So for the geological surveys, and BEG is the geological survey, of course, for Texas. Geological surveys helping other geological surveys to go through this process of understanding the national geology. It's their own resource. We're not trying to sell them anything or give them anything or make them buy anything IPR-wise. It's their own natural national resource. So those are two really key aspects, really, of the information that's asked for as a starting point by countries who come along. And then also, I think for the environmental NGOs, they do say, well, we can do everything with renewables, can't we? So there was a need for the role explained the role for CCS on, especially on sectors that you can't reduce emissions for by other means, in particular the cement sector and other industrial sectors as well. Because there was quite a common view in the environmental NGOs that you can do everything with renewables, but of course that's only a third of the electricity provision, is only a third of the world's emission sources anyway. And environmental NGOs, whilst they're not in the negotiations themselves, they can influence countries in some of their positions. So it's good to inform those. And we did see that from our survey of the side events, that those two audience groups were the ones most seeking and most in need of information, environmental NGOs and developing countries.
Thanks.
Dave, you had your hand up next. So
yes, Tim, thank you very much. That was a fascinating insider's view at the high level, which I know I don't get to see very much. But I've got a couple speculative questions. How soon do you see CCUS becoming a real business, one in the US and then two internationally? I realize it's a very open-ended, totally speculative question, but I'd be curious to hear what your opinion is.
So I think it's becoming that now in the US because of the 45Q tax credit and the enhancement that it got a couple of years ago. So I understand there's a lot of companies seriously interested in and progressing CCUS projects and CCUS as a business in the US. We're hearing the same starting in Canada with their national tax credit that just got announced, I think earlier this month or the end of last month. So the US is sort of leading the way in a business sense in the market for CCUS. The rest of the world, it depends on the policies that each country puts in place. I'm having to be based in the UK, and the UK government, having missed a couple of opportunities over the last decade, is now quite serious about CCUS clusters. And by acting seriously, it's generated a lot of serious interest. And there are about 6 or 7 clusters under development in the UK now. I say clusters, these are bringing together industrial sources into one hub and one storage site. And there's 2 of those are in the first track, and they're meant to be operational by the mid-2020s, with 2 more operational by 2030. And the government's putting, hundreds of millions, sort of a top number of £1 billion, $1.5 billion into these. But companies are putting their own time and effort in as well. They see this as the future. And the UK government's very much working on the business models for which bits does the government have to step in and support in a UK business sense, and which bits can they leave to the private sector to manage. But it's moving forward quite quickly. So, and I think, I don't have the figure to hand, but there's a recent quote in this last week from ExxonMobil. I think they've quantified the world market for CCUS by the 2030 or 2050. It's big numbers.
Thank you, Tim.
okay, I see Michael Young. You are next in the list.
Thank you, Tim. Great to see you, and I'm glad you're feeling better from having that nasty COVID. My question has to do with basically terrestrial carbon, and where you see there's a lot of discussion in the U.S. about creating frameworks for understanding kind of the MVA of soil carbon and terrestrial carbon. Where do you see this fitting into the overall picture? I think the Europeans are probably 5 years ahead of the US in this, but do you have any thoughts about that going forward?
Yes. Okay. No, you're right. and the role of soil carbon is getting increasingly recognized as a means of doing CO2 removal from the atmosphere. And what's also coming through, and the Europeans are working on a policy or a form of accounting for such CDR, including soil carbon things at the moment, they've not got the outcomes of that yet. But the issue of the permanence of the CO2 storage is being recognized as an issue. And the question is how to account for that permanence. So some things such as CO2 geological storage is for thousands to millions of years. Mineralization in minerals can be similar, and CO2 locked into cements can be similar lifetimes. Biochar, which is putting carbon into the soil in an engineered way, can be several hundreds of years, at least. But other soil management techniques can be just for a few years, with the risk of, if the landowner then changes the soil management practices, that CO2 could be released again. But there's still a benefit in doing it in the short term. So how to account for that in the way that carbon credits are generated. So there was work underway. I'm not aware that there are the answers yet, but the benefit of doing all of these things is being recognized, along with the issue of the permanence of how long that CO2 is then stored for. And also not just with soils, but also with forestry as well. Now, forestation, reforestation, very important. But again, there's quite a risk, increasingly with climate change, with forest fires, versus the carbon stock that maybe in those forests, as Microsoft found out, was it last year in Oregon, when a lot of their carbon offset forests were impacted by the climate, by the fires there. So it's important because all mitigation is important. I think it's one of the areas you work on, so I would encourage your work further in that, particularly in the carbon balance side of things there.
Thank you, Tim.
Okay, next I think we'll move to the chat again. Alex, you had the next question. Did you want to unmute?
Thanks, Kelly. And thanks, Tim. That was a really thought-provoking talk. I actually have two questions for you. They might even be related. But the first, sort of inspired by Sue's question, what's the insight that you don't have that you really wish you did have? That is the research, the directions for future research that you wish you'd like to see moving forward. And the second one, perhaps related, is just that the observation that the political extremes on both left and right hate CCS. Right? One sees it as propping up fossil fuels, the other sees it as meddling in business. And I'm wondering if you found an effective way of addressing either or both of them.
Those are two very good questions, Alex. The questions are probably better than my answers are going to be, I think. In terms of research gaps missing at the COPs, I don't know if it's a research gap, but I think being able to demonstrate through publishing in peer-reviewed literature that we have the means to do the proving of storage security. So having all the papers that were produced, for example, from Cranfield and everything else since. And so when monitoring is done and risk assessments are done for commercial scale projects, being able to get something that's published in the peer review literature that you can point to, I think. So it's not a single missing insight, but that's a means to answering questions and evidence. It contributes to the evidence base in the peer reviewed world for demonstrating storage security. So that's the answer to that. In terms of the political question, well, I've always been really impressed by the US that it's been a bipartisan-ish topic of favor, and whatever flavor of administration was in place, CCUS has been supported in the US. And I think the answer to the ones on the extreme right would be it's in businesses' interests to future-proof their activities against climate change and climate change policies. So CCUS is a really important way of doing that. And that's really emphasized a lot in the latest IPCC Working Group 3 report. And it's a shame they didn't really put a figure in there, a graphic in there. But the issue around stranded assets, they emphasize that a lot. The risk of fossil fuel stranded assets with future mitigation, unless they've got CCS on them. And that goes for not just power stations and infrastructures and pipelines, but also fossil fuel reserves that are still in the ground as well, that many companies' valuations are based upon the value of those reserves. So, and investments, pension funds investing in those companies, a lot, they could future-proof themselves by investing more on CCUS to enable their reserves or assets to be used in a low carbon way. So hopefully that went towards answering your question, your very good questions, Alex.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, good stuff.
Okay, Bo, I see you already turned your video on, so go ahead.
Yeah. So thanks, team. My small question is related to the CCS versus CCUS EUR. So how do you see the near future development, let's say less than 10 years, for the CCUS EUR versus CCS? Is the CCUS EUR a more tangible option for oil companies, particularly for those in developing countries? Thanks.
So it is for the oil companies, yes, because of the economic benefit, as you know, from the enhanced oil recovery. But for developing countries who generally look to get some form of climate finance to assist them, CO2 EUR is regarded very badly by climate finance providers. So the Green Climate Fund will not fund anything to do with CO2 EUR, even though there's a mitigation benefit potentially through doing it. It's just this topic they will not go near at all. So if a company wants to progress and start a CCS, CO2 EUR activity, it's fine for them to go ahead and take into account the extra economic benefits in the EUR, but it does rule them out from accessing climate finance. So it's really got to be done on a case by case and country by country basis, I think, when we're looking at that. But it certainly does jumpstart, as you know, the investment in the infrastructure needed that at least can be used as the oil field production drops off in the future, for more transitioning over to more storage and then straight storage in the future as well. But I certainly can't put any numbers on that transition, other than to say it's a case by case basis.
Thank you.
Okay, Charles, you would be the next.
Yes, Tim, just a full point really, but it sometimes helps to know which arguments are not worth having any longer. And I wonder if there's a confusion in lots of people's minds between zero emission energy and renewable energy. Because when people talk about propping up fossil fuel, they can mean all sorts of things. But if you're talking to people who are after renewable energy, there's no point talking about CCS, is there?
That's right. And so that's and yeah, the only way I tackle that really is by saying that renewables can't do it all. So what are you going to do about the other 2/3 of the world's emissions? And in particular, those from large-scale industrial sources such as cement and iron and steel. But it doesn't always get the traction that you'd expect, because I think people get very rightly motivated on climate change. They get there's an emotional part of their concern and their action, and we want people to be concerned about climate change because it is the biggest threat to the planet. But because there's that emotional engagement as well, I think it is hard get some of the sort of rational facts and reality checks over. And I've been working in CCS for 20 years now, and I've thought about it a lot, but not found a way of portraying CCUS as being trendy or sexy. Or I'm still trying to think of something that makes it exciting for NGOs or for lay people to because they can't put it on their houses, they can't put it in their farms. It's quite hard to make it connect with the average person in the street. So ideas welcomed.
Thanks, Tim.
All right, and we're running a little bit over time, but we've got one last question from Ramon Gillegui. So he says he doesn't have a mic, so I'll just ask it for him. So Ramon asks, Tim, do you think the anti-fossil narrative has lost weight at the decision political level due to a more pragmatic vision of the necessary transition to a low carbon economy?
Thank you, Ramon, for that. I'd like to say yes, but we live, so at the serious level, yes. The anti-fossil narrative has lost weight because of the work of the IEA in particular that show, countries can't just switch off their fossil fuel energy systems tomorrow. There's got to be a transition at least, et cetera, et cetera. But we do live in a world of politics that's driven by sound bites in some countries. And the anti-fossil soundbite is attractive to some because it gets people re-elected with the wider electorate, without realizing that how much the whole economies and products and services rely upon fossil fuels. So I think in the serious world of the scientists and the negotiators in climate change, it has lost weight in that sense, and hence the word unabated being put in, for example, in the Glasgow Climate Pact. But I think the decisions that are made by ministers in countries, not necessarily. But we have, so we have to keep we have to keep our work up with whoever we're talking to, from people in the street to government ministers and secretaries of state, to make sure that they understand that fossil fuels can't be just switched off, but they can have their emissions mitigated very successfully.
Well, thanks a bunch, Tim. This was a really fascinating talk, and I'm glad to see so many people engaged and interested in seeing how the Bureau can help you. So thank you again for joining us today, and I hope that you are fully on the mend soon. And we hope to meet you here in person at the Bureau at some point in the future.
Okay.
To everybody who's still on, thank you again for joining us. And as a reminder, next week, April 29th, we will have Adam Simon of the University of Michigan giving a talk on metal resources for the transition to carbon neutrality. So I'll see you guys then.
Thank you very much, Kelly, and thank you everyone for the questions. And it's a pleasure to be invited and to work with you all as well. Sue, Catherine, Ramon, and everybody else, and Ramon. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.